This lecture is intended to provide an overview of an extremely vast array of topics and of the relations among them. Each of the three terms included for the lecture on the course guide, imperialism, Marxism, Anticolonialism, could easily constitute the subject of a course in their own right, indeed of a lifetime's worth of study. The topic is thus truly immense. To render it somewhat more manageable, I will focus the bulk of my efforts here on the task of recovering a history and tradition which, in the words of Robert J.C. Young, has been, at least in Europe and North America, willfully effaced, namely the tradition of anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis. The exploration of the contours and content of this tradition will be organized so as to address two basic questions in relation to a host of core readings included in the course guide. The questions are, one, what is the relevance of the recuperation of liberation theory in relation to post-colonial and or decolonial critiques of Marxism? And two, how should we evaluate the claim that Marxism constitutes the fundamental framework of post-colonial thinking? The lecture will center the arguments advanced in an exemplary, indeed canonical text from the anti-colonial liberationist tradition, namely Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, first published in 1950. It will situate and help render intelligible these arguments by relating them to other core readings, including chapters from Robert Young's monumental book from 2000, Postcolonialism, an Historical Introduction, as well as Benita Perry's chapter on liberation theory, variations on themes of Marxism and modernity, in Crystal Bartolovich's and Neil Lazarus's important 2011 volume on Marxism, modernity, and post-colonial studies, and the article by Subir Sinha and Rashmi Varma's introduction to a 2017 special issue of Critical Sociology dedicated to the question of Marxism and post-colonialism, what's left of the debate. From anti-colonialism to post-colonialism. The task of recovering the tradition of anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis, of taking lessons from this willfully effaced tradition, necessarily requires us to navigate and engage with the rather contentious terrain of somewhat more familiar contemporary intellectual debate, namely the debate about the relationship between Marxism and post-colonialism. If anti-colonialism eventually gave way to post-colonialism, it is post-colonialism that we are much closer to, and thus most likely more familiar with, since it has a substantial presence in the contemporary Western academy, perhaps especially in cultural studies and literature departments, even if as an orientation or intellectual tradition, it has remained somewhat marginalized within the discipline of sociology, at least up until very recently. The recent emergence of calls to decolonize the discipline of sociology as part of a broader agenda and movement, both activist and scholarly, to decolonize the university, can be interpreted as a logical extension of the claims and epistemic standpoint of post-colonial theory. So let us begin by situating post-colonial theory and then working our way back to the tradition and lessons of anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis. Robert Young's book, Postcolonialism, an Historical Introduction, proves quite useful in this regard. Young begins the book by interpreting the birth of post-colonial theory as the mark of a new phase within many Western societies in which immigrants from the global South had begun to emerge as influential cultural voices, challenging the basis of the manner in which European and North American societies represented themselves and their own histories. Though he also mentions arguments to the effect that so-called post-colonial critiques were somehow preparing the way for the transformation of society that was being produced by the demands of neoliberal globalization. Young's book attempts nothing short of a genealogy of post-colonial theory in terms of its relation to earlier political and intellectual movements resisting imperialism and the cultural dominance of the West. In it, he manages to trace the origins of post-colonial theory in the struggle against colonialism in the past, that is, in what we, following Benita Perry, have already referred to as the tradition of anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis. According to Young, contemporary post-colonial theory was grounded in the inspiration of the work of earlier activists such as Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, C.L.R. James, Albert Memmi, or even in those who were viewed more critically, such as Leopold Sedar Senghor or Marcus Garvey. And yet, Perry herself has lamented, in contrast to Young, what she interprets as a tendency among post-colonial critics to disown liberation discourses and practices and indeed all forms of anti-colonial rhetoric and organization. So we can already begin to see that the depiction of post-colonial theory, in particular of its continuities and or discontinuities with anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis, is a source of considerable contention among contemporary scholars. This is a point to which we shall return. Liberation theory as disjunctive Marxism. But first, let us try to get a feel for what anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis was all about. One of the great virtues of Young's book is the extent to which in it he manages to convey the excitement of the intellectual productivity of the time, the sense of its radical potential and its dynamic political aspirations for transformation, and in the process of recovering such excitement, such sense of possibility, to make the case that the anti-colonial tradition can even continue to offer political inspiration into the future. On this point, Perry would most certainly agree. Memories of the future, she suggests, might indeed provide an epithet appropriate for capturing the legacy of liberation theory. However, to understand this legacy requires taking into account, first and foremost, fundamentally that anti-colonial liberation theory and praxis constitutes a variant of the Marxist tradition. Indeed, as Young rightly emphasizes in his book, the Bolshevik Revolution functioned as a fulcrum for the development of anti-colonial politics. After 1917, most activists, with the notable exception of Gandhi, turned to a secular Marxism for inspiration and strength, even if, he is also careful to add, they did not treat it as reverentially as the functionaries of the Comintern expected and required. Young further explains, for much of the 20th century, it was Marxism alone which emphasized the effects of the imperialist system and the dominating power structure involved, and in sketching out blueprints for a future free from domination and exploitation, most 20th century anti-colonial writing was inspired by the possibilities of socialism. The contribution of whom Young refers to as the tricontinental theorists was to mediate the translatability of Marxist revolutionary theory with the untranslatable features of specific non-European historical and cultural contexts. Indeed, Young even goes so far as to insist that Marxism, which represents both a form of revolutionary politics and one of the richest and most complex theoretical and philosophical movements in human history, has always been in some sense anti-Western, since it was developed by Marx as a critique of Western social and economic practices and the values which they embody. To this end, he reminds us that the Bolsheviks themselves always identified their revolution as Eastern. And yet, as Perry denounces at the outset of her brilliant, if admittedly polemical, article on liberation theory, few of the major Marxist meta-theorists in Europe have undertaken to examine the roads taken by Marxism on colonial terrains. Such systematic omissions, such shrill silences on the part of Western Marxists, she diagnoses as part and parcel of the wider and long-standing exclusion of non-Western knowledge from the canons compiled by metropolitan scholars, a point on which Perry again converges with Young, in whose judgment Western Marxists have preferred to marginalize what took place in the non-European world, despite the fact that that is exactly where Marxism successfully developed its practical revolutionary dynamics and achieved political power. Young classifies the kind of Marxism articulated and advanced in the anti-colonial liberation tradition as a disjunctive Marxism, indeed, even as a transculturated Marxism. What does he mean by such characterizations? Put simply, he means that it was a particular kind of Marxism. In his words, if the bulk of anti-colonialist activism and activist writing in the 20th century has operated from a Marxist perspective, for the most part, it is a Marxism which has been aware of the significance of subjective conditions for the creation of a revolutionary situation, and therefore a Marxism which has been pragmatically modified to suit non-Western conditions and which does not, as a result, altogether coincide with that of the classical mainstream. As such, he contends, anti-colonial or tricontinental Marxism does not necessarily come in recognizable universal Western forms. Though he is quick to add that in being a flexible Marxism, able to transform itself continually in response to specific historical conditions, without ever becoming dogmatically fixed, it remains close to the spirit of Marx and particularly Lenin. To this end, he highlights that Lenin's orientation towards Asia and Africa after the Bolshevik Revolution, as the great Trinidadian socialist George Padmore observed, was a violent departure from orthodox Marxist strategy. What we have then, according to Young, is a Marxism developed outside and generally neglected in the West, a flexible Marxism responsive to local conditions in the three continents, which is in turn reminiscent of Fanon's famous claim in the first chapter concerning violence of The Wretched of the Earth, that Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. Indeed, that everything up to and including the very nature of pre-capitalist society, so well explained by Marx, must here be thought out again. But let us return to the point about the Bolsheviks and their revolution. Young is certainly right to insist that the Bolshevik revolution that emerged from the deprivation and destruction of the First World War changed the whole dynamic, not only of European class politics, but also of imperial and colonial relations. Most momentously, as he notes, for the first time, a government of a powerful state was explicitly opposed to Western imperialism in principle and practice. And indeed, it was Lenin's Comintern that in 1920 offered the first systematic program for global decolonization in its Theses on the National and Colonial Questions. Nevertheless, if it is the case, as Young contends, that Marxism was central to the thinking and practice of probably a majority of the national liberation movements in the three continents after 1917, that with some exceptions, Marxism historically provided the theoretical inspiration and most effective political practice for 20th century anti-colonial resistance, it is worth further specifying its great strength as instrument through which anti-colonial struggle could be translated from one colonial arena to another. In a word, according to Young, Marxism supplied a translatable politics and political language through which activists in very different situations could communicate with each other. It offered a universal medium, so to speak, through which specificities could be discussed in a common forum of anti-colonialism. The anti-colonial Marxism that thus emerged was a hybrid of East and West. In this regard, Young cites the cultural theorist David Forgax, who has contended that Marxist thinking, however rigorous in itself, tends to have a hybrid character. Indeed, Forgax argued that Marxism has taken shape by scrutinizing and sharpening itself, not only on the real world and not only on its own texts, but also against non-Marxist thinking. Marx himself, Forgax notes, developed his own thought in a critical dialogue with that of thinkers like Hegel, Ricardo, and Proudhon, that is, as a hybrid forged in both deep familiarity and ruthless critique of the traditions of German philosophy, of British political economy, and French libertarian socialism. Hybridization, then, has always been a characteristic of Marxism, which throughout the 20th century, as a philosophy and as a political practice, has always interacted productively with other disciplines, geographies, cultures, and political contexts. Anti-colonial Marxism was no different in this respect. In the colonial or tricontinental arena, Marxism developed according to the demands of different social and cultural contexts in ways that remain often unrecognized in the West. Anti-colonial Marxism thus amounted to a reformulation, a translation, and a transformation of Marxism. It constituted a critical dynamic tradition within Marxism, even if Marxists in Europe or Orthodox Marxists elsewhere have generally only taken limited account of and barely acknowledged the importance of the non-European forms of Marxism. With that, I think we should take a break.